I'm Simon Rawlinson. I'm a partner at Arcadis and I am responsible for strategic research and insight. I'm also a member of the Construction Leadership Council. Yes, I think it is. I think blockchain has a fantastic role in asserting ownership of assets, and it potentially has a really important role as a piece of what you might describe as utility, helping plumb various business models together. I think that's a really interesting question. I think there are one or two sectors, perhaps financial services, perhaps automotive, that have got enough volume of transactions that can be supported by blockchain to create a case for investment. Whether that's really where the benefit is delivered in the long term, I think is an interesting question. If one thinks about some of the use cases, for example, in India, in asserting ownership of title associated with property, the potential to scale that up is absolutely enormous. I've also seen a really interesting use case in connection with container traffic. If you can imagine how many millions and millions of container movements there are per year, and using blockchain to sort of manage some of those document and information exchanges in connection with that is again a great illustration of how really complicated but really low value, massive volume transactions could be transformed by technology like blockchain. I think it's sectors that have very large volumes of the same kind of transaction. And I've already mentioned financial services, which is an obvious great example. One thing that struck me is a really interesting one. A few months ago, Kodak made an announcement around blockchain as using it as a tool to assert ownership of images. And that just strikes me as a great example of something where they want to keep it as low cost as possible, but they want to be able to increase the volume of transactions around people using images. And that seems to encompass what blockchain's about. It's about trustless transactions, it's about maximizing volume, it's about keeping costs down. Okay, they're quite complicated use cases because if one thinks about cities, if one thinks about energy, they're going through massive transformation at the moment anyway. So energy, for example, we're moving to a decentralized model with completely new sources of energy, offshore wind, for example, solar, what have you. So the idea that these sectors that are undergoing so much change would become a rapid adopter of blockchain is an interesting one, because on one side it could drive some very early what you might describe as some disruptive transformation. On the other side, large investors might be waiting for a while for the market to settle down. So my guess would be in the first horizon, 5 years, we might see one or two disruptive people coming in with the technology that's underpinned by blockchain. It makes their life easier. And then you might see the development of utilities that underpin how cities operate across, let's say, for example, mobility as a service, CAV, all of those kind of things emerging in, say, 10, 15 years. So as these really, really massive changes come through, blockchain will be part of a portfolio of different technologies that are transforming the way that we use cities. In our sector, I think it's really interesting because a lot of the use cases that are articulated, smart contracts, for example, are often incredibly complicated. But if you think about a smart contract in its simplest essence, something happens and as a result something's recorded. It could have massive impact in our sector. So the use cases that I quite like to think about are ones around information being exchanged from one party to another, information changing, rather than the idea that you'd run an entire construction contract on the basis of smart contracts. Yeah. So I think the right kind of thinking aligned to our industry, again, huge volumes of the same transaction, keeping the costs low, is a really important opportunity for us to drive productivity into what we know is an industry that has a lot of latency. I'd like to see use cases that are focused on large volumes of simple repeated transactions, where in particular the potential need for actually being able to know what happened in the past becomes really important. So one of those items might be dispute resolution, for example. Not that you fix the dispute using blockchain, but you've got the record of what happened. Another one, and very pertinent now, unfortunately, is in the aftermath of the Grenfell disaster, knowing who did what on a construction project, who installed what, whether it was done properly, whether it was signed off, incredibly valuable in the future, and it's the kind of stuff that you'd want to see blockchain enabling people to provide effectively the assurance that work has been done properly. I think, I'm going to be honest, I think in the construction sector, there are some demonstration use cases. I've seen some, for example, around recording the sort of hire transactions around plant. But to be quite honest, I don't think they really demonstrate significant value. So I would go back to the mature use cases in other sectors. The blood diamond one is a classic. This sort of container one, which I've seen, which sort of start to give some clues about how you create volume across a range of players, doing something that is inherently valuable to them. So I would think about where cost is often wasted in our industry, which is either the absence of a single version of the truth, or the amount of disputes that go on, or the duplication of process, and thinking about how we can eliminate cost and drive value through those kind of mechanisms. I think CBC has a really important role in terms of bringing various actors together from our industry, and doing that in an area which is pretty safe. It's not necessarily involving a huge amount of investment, bringing skills from outside the sector in terms of coders, and skills from within the sector in terms of people who understand how it operates. It then has a role in creating ambition around some really big use cases. So we've seen one around, for example, project finance, and it also has one around being what you might describe as pragmatic. What can we do to introduce the greatest volumes of investment around the biggest opportunities? So I think there's a lot of roles that CBC has to play. And there's a really interesting you might not have seen this in last week's budget, which is that the digital catapult is looking at developing early use cases in various sectors, and interestingly construction is one of the ones that's been highlighted in the budget announcement last week. I think the challenge is firstly that the industry doesn't necessarily have a huge amount of spare capital to invest. So actually and thinking about some of the other big challenges that are out there, it might not be the priority. So that's number one. Number two is that the industry doesn't really have a agreed, settled process. So even something as simple as, let's say, for example, people getting paid, whereas in banks it's the same thing across every bank across the world. So there are billions of transactions. It doesn't work like that in construction. So that one around coming around instantly repeatable use cases is quite difficult. I think that blockchain creates the potential for having a much better knowledge base about what is going on now, i.e. in terms of whether something is owned, who owns it, what have you, and what happened in the past. So I think it has two transformative effects. One of which is that you can actually create a real-time market for assets. And the use case I'd use there would be, let's for example, a digital object, the equivalent of an image sold by Kodak. The fact that you can potentially secure payment for every time it's used changes the way in which we design and construct things. So that's number one. And second one, this idea of knowing what happened in the past potentially then means that people have greater confidence about taking risks around how they design things, how they share information, who they get to complete work, for example. Because if you're confident you know who did it, even though you might not necessarily know exactly who did it, then it enables you to do things in a slightly different way. And at the moment we've fudged those things. In reality, as Grenfell demonstrated, no designer knows who really designs the work, no designer knows who actually installs the work, no client really knows what's going on. So blockchain enables you to start thinking about how do we make that situation right. I think blockchain poses quite a few risks for players in the built environment. I think the first one is that it potentially is a what you might describe as an enclosed club. So if you think about some of the current organisations that are rolling out blockchain, R3 for example, it's a private entity, and our industry is one which is incredibly fragmented. So the idea that you've got an organisation that's running an information platform on behalf of players, then you'd ask the question, well, who's it acting on behalf of? Is it really a utility, or is it actually representing one body or another, whether it's clients, contractors, what have you? So I think that's risk number one. Risk number two is a genuine and sensible one, which is it doesn't work. And so therefore you potentially get a lot of early investment in something that doesn't deliver returns, and that it sort of effectively pulls the tap off on effectively digital investment in industry transformation. And in the end, blockchain is only one of many tools that you could potentially use to drive this. And then I think the final one is that, a bit like BIM, it delivers a huge amount of information that nobody knows what to do with. And that probably is the greatest risk of all, which is, once you've got all of this stuff, how do you make any sense of it? I personally think blockchain is a really interesting opportunity for people in the industry to really think about how our supply chains operate, and how we introduce huge amounts of waste into the way that we do things. So if I describe it, fashionable way of describing things now, a thought experiment. And if you practically thought about how something is built, who does the work, how things are ordered and everything else, and then you said, how would we put that on a blockchain? And then you just think about how complicated that is, how irregular the process is, how nobody really absolutely has it nailed down. That becomes a really good start point to then think about what is it that we can make work using blockchain. And that's where I hope we'll focus on in CBC, think about where we can add greatest value using this amazing technology.